Alright everyone, we start off today talking about the greatest trick that communism ever pulled, and that was convincing that a lot of people, specifically the Western younger generations, that communism was no longer a threat. It became easier after the fall, of course, of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union falls apart, and then somehow, despite the fact that Venezuela is still there, China is still there, Vietnam's still there, North Korea is still there, etc., etc., despite the fact that there were multiple socialistic nations in Africa and elsewhere, for some reason people got it into their heads, well, communism's been defeated by, now we no longer have to worry about it. Now, we have to preface this by noting one thing. Communism is not a puristic theory at this point. For instance, if you look at critical race theory, which is part of Marxism, it doesn't have anything to do with class struggle. In fact, it openly pushes it to the side in order to introduce race struggle. But it's still part of Marxism. The basic formulaic concept is still there. The reduction of civilization, the destruction of what we would consider enlightened Western culture, partially because of the imperialism of Eastern Bloc countries. A lot of it really didn't boil down even so much to ideology. There was never puristic capitalism in the NATO countries. There was never puristic communism, with the exception kind of Pol Pot, within the Eastern Bloc countries. The USSR was a communist country in the general broad ideological sense. But the economy of the Soviet Union was not 100% centrally planned. The same is true of China. In the wake of their counter-revolution in the 1980s especially, you've got a facade free market system that is extremely laissez-faire. The centrality there is just the capability of the government to exert force rather than its actual exertion of force at all times. This is the thing that people don't understand about communism. The central power of a government is not requisite on the government making every decision. You can give people the illusion of as much freedom of agency as possible, but the government at all times, sometimes in cooperation with other groups, makes it easier, corporations, religions, whatever, is capable of always exerting power. There are no limitations in theory to its exertion. This is the true nature of communistic tyranny. If anything, it's grown much worse since the Cold War technically ended, because the West kept pumping money into these countries to try to bring them into the larger world. That worked, but now they've begun to infect other countries, because they never got rid of the centrality and authoritarianism. They set up facade-free markets and facade-free trade agreements, and it's just a facade. The imperialism is actually worse now, which is why China pushes critical race theory explicitly in the West. It's why wokeness is pushed by the Eastern Bloc in Western states while they avoid it themselves, etc., etc. Now, first and foremost, before we get into this video a little bit further, refuting the concept that this is boomerism, which I hear bandied around by people who have bizarre political beliefs of their own and usually don't understand recent U.S. history. Keep in mind, down below there will be a pinned comment if you're watching this video on YouTube with links to 5 other video hosting sites that I use. Keep in mind, there will be several exclusives every day that I upload to those sites, and they do not make it onto YouTube. 2 or 3 a day, it depends. Sometimes, like today, I woke up later, or if I have a live stream, I do 2. Otherwise, I do a third. Unless it's non-political, then I do a third video that also goes on YouTube, and the 2 New Tech exclusives. So, it's a balancing act. I basically do what I want. I make plenty of videos. Nobody can fault me for working too little. Anyway, here's the thing. It relates to the potato analogy that I make for critical race theory. Okay, with critical race theory, the ideology is being peddled without the actual term to describe it. It's like saying potato versus art apple or pomme de terre. I've made the metaphor before. In brief, for anyone who hasn't heard it, the labels are different. The potato and the pomme de terre, well, that's not the same word. Once you begin, though, describing the attributes of the thing, they come closer and closer together, and you realize that they're, at very least, very related, and in some cases, they are identical. In the case of the potato and the art apple, you are fundamentally describing the same thing. Maybe one of them is a russet and the other one's a red potato. Beyond that, though, basically, they're identical. When you have critical race theory versus wokeness, equity, racial justice curricula, it's 95% the same thing. Read through the curricula, match it up with what critical race theory exponents propound, you'll see the overlap. It's the same thing. They've just decided to take a toxic label, like communism happens to be, and that plays a role in this, and discard it in favor of the ideology being promulgated without the term. Same is true of communism. When you understand that it is not a purist, the idea that a purist Marxist, stateless, gun-toting, arguably, society was ever promulgated in its puristic form by Eastern Bloc countries, well, it wasn't. Now, of course, that central puristic ideology is also incapable of working. Effectively, it's a form of anarchism that nonetheless requires organizational effort to promulgate its equality. You're relying upon a well-armed society under stress not to potentially devolve into tribalism. You're basing it off of primitive communism, an archaeological and anthropological theory by a man who never conducted any anthropology and sat in an armchair reading books, reading and writing about tribes he himself never actually encountered, using now outmoded knowledge that has been completely overturned by multiple archaeological expeditions. Marx was a failure. His central ideology won't work either. But communists will try to obfuscate in promoting communism by playing word games. So they'll say, well, it's not puristic Marxism, it had a state, therefore communism can work. But the thing is, the ideologies typically, if you look through the description of what they can call themselves, I'm an Asbol, I'm a Tanky, I'm a communist, I'm a Soc Dem, I'm a socialist, I'm an anarcho-socialist, an anarcho-communist, I'm a left libertarian. Ignore the labels that they give themselves. Look at what they're actually describing, and you'll see that there are a significant number of connections. And one of the biggest connections, it's not invariable. There are definitely leftoids, I would say, that maybe confuse themselves with communists at times, who buck this trend. If you look at most of these people, though, you will find that they are engaged in, effectively, and I don't think most of them realize this, promulgating Eastern Bloc imperialism. So, for instance, they will say the U.S. builds a new base. That's imperialism, terror, the U.S. is world policing, nations shouldn't do this. China engages in the same behavior. Because they use the facade communism as a general term for their ideology, it can't be imperialism. No, they're leftist. No, they're not evil capitalist bourgeois pigs. They can't be imperialistic. Yes, they invaded Vietnam on 2 different occasions in the 1970s. That wasn't imperialism, trying to force a neighbor to accede to your ideological demands. When the Vietnamese invaded Pol Pot, when the Cambodians crossed the border and attacked the Vietnamese, when Russia and China diplomatically squabbled for several decades over which communism was more pure, because both of them sought to do that in order to control the bloc. It was for political and economic reasons. It wasn't for ideological ones. It doesn't even fucking matter which system you use. I suppose the Chinese system, once they heavily modified it, became more stable than the USSR, but part of this is geography, trust me. It has nothing to do with ideology at that point. But these countries vie for power. They're still doing that. China's building bases and infrastructure in other parts of the world. They're not doing it because they actually... The propaganda is, well, we care about our fellow man. We're just this sort of soft diplomacy. We're trying to win hearts and minds. Bullshit. That's not how countries operate. The concept of we're giving out of the kindness of our heart, we're building you roads, we're building you a rail line, we're building you... No. They're getting kickbacks for that. And implanting contractors and building a long-term, potentially quasi-military presence. What did they do in Nicaragua? Hey, we're going to build you a canal and make you richer than Panama. We're going to which was never going to happen. The Panama Canal expansion was already under construction. Build a canal. By the way, destroying thousands of farmers' lives in the process. They abandoned the project. There's no canal there, but there is a Chinese military base in the middle of Central America. It's a form of imperialism. Ultimately, the struggle between capitalism and communism was really never more than a facade for a struggle between the Western democratic small d countries and the Eastern Bloc and some associated groups that cling to the old world mythology of heavy centrality being required for a civilization to function, which we know isn't true. It's not been true throughout human history, and if anything, those systems destabilize and collapse more easily. But look at the potato analogy. Look at what people who are engaged in roughly this overarching communism declare as their ideology. Don't ask them what they are. Oh, I'm a Nazbol, I'm a socialist. That doesn't matter. Ask them what they believe on substantive, meaningful things. Then you will find the overlap. It's like if you look at my own views. They're nuanced. I don't agree with any partisan party or any broad ideology invariably. I've had people mistake me for a conservative, but if I were to start giving more importance to abortion or gay rights or environmentalism, minus the climate change bullshit, people would think I was a leftist all of a sudden because of the overlap. If you look more broadly at all of the things that I believe in, you find too much nuance to categorize me as like a traditional conservative. I lean maybe in economic terms more towards the populist side that's been embraced by so-called conservatives, but there are plenty of issues I completely deviate from them on. Likewise, one could consider me a liberal on certain moral and social issues, but if they look at my views on guns, it's not going to match up with the U.S. liberal movement at large. It's not going to match up on anything related to taxes or diplomacy in some cases. Certainly on the acceptance of communism or censorship. So when you see China, for example, a communist nation, in name, again, forget the broader ideology, it's the centrality that matters, that all of these regimes inevitably seem to have in common. When they are exporting their ideology to the United States by having huge amounts of stake in U.S. firms, supposedly U.S. firms, through globalism, which was allowed after opening up in the era of Nixon, etc., 70s and 80s, détente, and we'll draw them in with Coca-Cola. They're trying to do this to Vietnam, and it's working a little bit better. We're going to temper the Chinese and get them addicted to capitalism. They'll love it. They do love capitalism, so long as it's on their extremely centralistic, tyrannical, China-centric terms, which is why they're trying to export destabilization to the Western bloc nations, not just the United States. Perhaps Eastern Europe is right after all. They're stubbornly resisting it. It's funny because despite all of the oorah, bravado, and patriotism in the United States, there are more goods that are made in the Netherlands here, in a completely globalized economic framework, by the way, where import and export is real easy within the European economic community, than ever I saw even in small-town U.S. Closest doppelganger there is people have more land, so there are more people that like pickle their own goods and shit like that. People need to buy American and boycott Chinese goods, especially if they want to make any difference. And it's difficult to do that, even calling at this point. If you call for a boycott of China on some websites, you probably get banned. Now they've got TikTok, which has bought it all to hell and nowhere near as popular as it seems on the surface, but it's definitely used by the youth, which is exactly what you want to target if you want to subvert another nation. If you're patient and intelligent, you don't target people who are 70 years old now, do you? That's about all. Peace out.